Why overconfidence destroys you. The quiet truth. Pause before speaking.
Chapter 1. The most dangerous person is the one who thinks he cannot fall. The most dangerous form of destruction does not begin with weakness, it begins with certainty. Not the healthy kind, not the grounded kind. Not the quiet confidence built through discipline, scars, and experience. The dangerous kind is louder than that. Faster than that, it walks into a room believing it already understands everything before anyone speaks. It mistakes arrogance for intelligence. It mistakes attention for respect. It mistakes temporary success for permanent superiority. And the worst part is this: at first, it works. That is why overconfidence ruins so many lives. If it failed immediately, people would avoid it. But it does not fail immediately. It rewards you in the beginning. It gives you momentum. It gives you the illusion of power. It makes you feel untouchable. And once a human being starts feeling untouchable, they slowly stop protecting themselves from reality. That is where the fall begins. Every destroyed man once believed he was different. Different from the weak. Different from the careless. Different from the people who ruined their careers, their futures, their relationships, their reputations. He looked at other people's collapse and secretly thought, "That could never happen to me." That sentence has buried more people than failure ever did, because failure can teach you. Overconfidence cannot. Failure humbles a person. Failure forces reflection. Failure makes people examine themselves. But overconfidence creates blindness. It convinces you that self-examination is unnecessary. It teaches you to protect your ego instead of improving your character. It teaches you to perform strength instead of building it. And performance always collapses under pressure. That is why some people look powerful in calm situations but completely fall apart when life becomes difficult. Their confidence was never real. It was decoration. It was built on applause, comfort, image, validation, and temporary victories. But the moment reality stopped cooperating, the entire identity cracked open. Because reality does not care how confident you feel. Reality only responds to what is true. And truth is ruthless. Truth exposes weak preparation. Truth exposes laziness. Truth exposes emotional immaturity. Truth exposes fragile discipline. Truth exposes people who became addicted to admiration instead of mastery. The world is filled with people who became arrogant after a few victories and destroyed themselves because they stopped respecting the process that made them successful in the first place. They stopped studying. They stopped listening. They stopped preparing. They stopped learning. They stopped questioning themselves. And slowly they became weak while still feeling powerful. That is the terrifying part about overconfidence. It allows decay to happen invisibly. A person can be deteriorating mentally, emotionally, financially, socially, or professionally while still believing they are evolving. Because arrogance disconnects people from accurate self-awareness. The arrogant man does not see himself clearly anymore. He sees a fantasy version of himself, a carefully edited version, a protected version. A version that can do no wrong. And once a human being falls in love with that fantasy, reality becomes offensive to them. Correction feels like disrespect. Advice feels like insult. Criticism feels like attack. Truth feels personal. This is why overconfident people eventually isolate themselves. Not always physically, but psychologically. They stop hearing honest feedback because their ego filters everything through emotion. They only accept information that supports their self-image. Anything else gets rejected immediately. And once that happens, destruction becomes only a matter of time. Because no person survives long after they lose the ability to see themselves honestly. History is full of brilliant people destroyed by their own certainty, leaders who thought they could not lose, athletes who stopped training seriously after success, entrepreneurs who ignored warning signs because they believed their instincts were above caution, students who stopped learning because they thought talent alone would carry them, men who lost families because they thought pride mattered more than humility. The pattern never changes. Overconfidence whispers the same lie to everyone: you are above consequences. That is the lie. And human beings love that lie because it feels powerful. It feels intoxicating to believe you are exceptional. It feels satisfying to believe normal rules no longer apply to you. It feeds the ego in ways discipline never can. Discipline is quiet and repetitive. Arrogance is exciting. Discipline feels slow. Arrogance feels thrilling. But thrill is not strength, and excitement is not wisdom. A truly dangerous person is not the loudest person in the room. It is not the most arrogant person. It is not the man constantly trying to prove himself. The truly dangerous person is usually calm, careful, observant, measured, because real strength respects consequences. Real strength understands that one careless decision can destroy years of work. Real strength understands that life changes quickly. Real strength understands that discipline matters more than emotion. Real strength understands that ego is expensive. The weak person seeks superiority. The strong person seeks accuracy. That difference changes everything. An overconfident person wants to feel important more than they want to improve. That is why they hate uncomfortable truths. Improvement requires humility. It requires admitting gaps in knowledge. It requires accepting imperfection. The ego cannot tolerate that for long, so instead of improving, they begin performing. They start speaking with certainty about things they barely understand. They start pretending they are always composed. They start creating an image instead of a foundation, and eventually life tests the foundation. That is when the collapse happens, not because life is cruel, but because reality eventually exposes every illusion. Some people collapse publicly, others collapse privately, but the outcome is always similar. Anxiety replaces certainty. Panic replaces pride. Excuses replace accountability. And suddenly, the person who once looked invincible begins scrambling to explain how everything went wrong. But nothing went wrong suddenly. The destruction started years earlier, the moment they stopped respecting reality, the moment they believed success had made them untouchable, the moment they stopped listening carefully, the moment they stopped correcting themselves, the moment they stopped fearing their own blind spots. That is why intelligent people can become incredibly foolish once arrogance enters the mind. Intelligence without humility becomes dangerous. Talent without discipline becomes unstable. Confidence without self-awareness becomes self-destruction. A person can survive being underestimated. Very few survive overestimating themselves for too long, because overestimating yourself creates reckless decisions. It creates impatience. It creates emotional reactions. It creates laziness disguised as confidence. It creates a false sense of control. And false control is deadly. You see it everywhere. People speaking before thinking. People reacting emotionally instead of strategically. People making promises they cannot keep. People ignoring details because they believe details are beneath them. People refusing to apologize because their ego feels threatened. People destroying relationships because pride matters more than connection. People losing opportunities because arrogance made them careless. The frightening truth is this: overconfidence does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks charming, sometimes it looks ambitious, sometimes it looks charismatic, sometimes it even looks inspiring. That is why people fall into it so easily, because arrogance often disguises itself as confidence in the beginning. But there is one major difference: real confidence stays calm under correction. Arrogance becomes emotional under correction. A confident person can admit mistakes without collapsing internally. An arrogant person experiences correction as humiliation. That is why arrogant people often become defensive, angry, dismissive, sarcastic, or cold when challenged. Their identity depends on appearing superior, and identities built on superiority are extremely fragile. The strongest people in the world are usually the easiest to teach because they are not terrified of being wrong. They do not need perfection to protect their self-worth. They understand that learning never ends. They understand that growth requires discomfort. Overconfident people never understand this until reality humiliates them personally. That is usually the first moment they become honest. Pain has a way of forcing honesty into arrogant minds. Failure strips away illusion. Loss removes fantasy. Consequences destroy denial. And suddenly the person who thought they knew everything is forced to confront a terrifying realization: they were not nearly as prepared as they believed. That realization breaks many people because they built their identity on appearing strong rather than becoming strong. This is why self-awareness matters more than ego. Self-awareness protects you from becoming blind. Self-awareness keeps you grounded during success. Self-awareness forces reflection during victory, not just during failure. A wise person becomes more careful after success. A foolish person becomes more reckless. That difference determines almost everything in life. Because success changes people. Success amplifies character. If a disciplined person becomes successful, they usually become more disciplined. If an arrogant person becomes successful, they usually become unbearable. Power reveals character faster than struggle ever will. And nothing reveals weakness faster than giving an immature ego consistent validation. That is why some people self-destruct the moment life starts going well for them. They stop respecting limits. They stop respecting reality. They stop respecting preparation. They start believing their own image. And eventually, they lose the ability to distinguish confidence from delusion. That is the final stage of overconfidence. Delusion, a dangerous separation from reality where emotion becomes more trusted than evidence. At that point, collapse becomes inevitable because reality is patient. Reality does not argue with arrogant people. Reality waits. And eventually, reality collects every debt the ego tried to ignore. That is why overconfidence destroys people. Not because confidence is bad, but because arrogance convinces human beings to stop protecting themselves from truth. And the moment a person stops respecting truth, destruction quietly begins. Chapter 2. The ego wants applause, reality wants discipline. The ego is never satisfied with simple progress. It always wants proof. Proof that you are smarter than other people. Proof that you are more capable. Proof that you are special. Proof that you deserve admiration. And once the ego becomes addicted to that feeling, discipline slowly begins to disappear. That is the hidden danger most people never notice. They think destruction begins with failure. It does not. Destruction begins the moment a person starts valuing appearance more than accuracy. Because once appearances become the priority, everything changes. Decisions become emotional. Conversations become performances. learning becomes selective. The person no longer asks, "What is true?" They ask, "How do I maintain the image I created?" That is when the decline begins, quietly, almost invisibly. The frightening part about ego is that it can imitate confidence perfectly in the beginning. It speaks with certainty, it moves quickly, it sounds persuasive, it radiates energy. Other people often mistake that intensity for leadership, but intensity is not wisdom, and certainty is not intelligence. Some of the most dangerous people in the world are deeply convinced they are right. That is why arrogance destroys lives more efficiently than insecurity ever could. An insecure person hesitates. An insecure person questions themselves. An insecure person may move slowly because they fear mistakes. But an overconfident person charges forward without reflection. And a human being moving in the wrong direction with absolute certainty becomes incredibly destructive. To themselves, to their future, to everyone around them. This is why so many intelligent people ruin their own lives after success. Success feeds the ego if the mind is not disciplined enough to handle praise. The applause changes them. The attention changes them. They begin believing that admiration is evidence of superiority. It is not. Admiration only means people noticed you. Nothing more. The world is filled with admired people who are internally weak. People who can command attention but cannot command themselves. People who look confident publicly but are emotionally fragile privately. People who built an image so polished that they forgot the image was never the real foundation. And eventually, reality tests foundations, not appearances. Reality does not care how convincing you sound. It does not care how charismatic you appear. It does not care how many people praise you online. Reality only cares whether your habits, decisions, and discipline can survive pressure. That is why so many confident people collapse under stress. Pressure reveals truth. Pressure removes performance. Pressure exposes who prepared and who merely talked. When pressure enters the room, the ego begins to panic because the ego depends on control. It depends on certainty. It depends on superiority. But pressure creates unpredictability, and unpredictability terrifies arrogant people. Why? Because arrogant people secretly build their identity around always appearing capable. The moment uncertainty appears, they feel threatened internally. That is why they overreact during criticism. That is why they become defensive during disagreement. That is why they interrupt constantly. That is why they hate admitting mistakes. Because every correction feels like damage to the identity they worked so hard to protect. But the truth is this: a person obsessed with appearing strong usually becomes mentally weak, because they cannot tolerate discomfort. And growth requires discomfort. Growth requires hearing things that wound the ego. Growth requires acknowledging blind spots. Growth requires accepting that you are unfinished. Arrogant people cannot handle that emotionally. They want the reward of mastery without enduring the humiliation of learning. They want authority without correction. They want respect without accountability. Life never works that way for long. Eventually, reality demands payment, and reality always charges arrogant people the highest price. Look carefully at most personal downfalls, and you will find the same pattern repeating again and again. A person achieves something meaningful. Then they become comfortable. Then they stop refining themselves. Then they stop listening. Then they become emotionally reactive. Then they start believing they are untouchable. Then reality humiliates them. Every time, because discipline disappears the moment ego becomes the priority. Discipline is difficult because discipline requires honesty. Discipline forces a person to confront what they would rather avoid. It forces repetition. It forces patience. It forces structure. It forces restraint. The ego hates restraint because restraint feels ordinary. The ego wants dramatic victories. Discipline accepts slow progress. The ego wants recognition immediately. Discipline focuses on consistency. The ego wants to feel superior. Discipline wants to become capable. That difference changes destinies. A disciplined person may appear less impressive initially because they move carefully. They prepare. They think deeply before acting. They ask questions. They remain teachable. Their confidence is quieter because it is rooted in preparation instead of emotion. But over time, disciplined people become unstoppable because their strength is real. Meanwhile, arrogant people often peak early because they become careless after initial success. Carelessness is the natural child of overconfidence. When people begin believing they are above consequences, they stop respecting details. They stop preparing properly. They stop double-checking decisions. They stop examining risks. They begin operating emotionally instead of intelligently. That emotional blindness creates destruction slowly. One ignored warning becomes two. One careless habit becomes routine. One emotional reaction damages trust. One arrogant decision creates unnecessary enemies. One moment of pride destroys years of work. And suddenly, the confident person who once looked powerful begins unraveling publicly. Most people watching are shocked. But the collapse was building quietly for years. That is how arrogance works. It weakens people privately before embarrassing them publicly. The ego always convinces people they have more control than they actually do. That illusion creates dangerous behavior. A person starts assuming they can recover from anything. They assume mistakes will not affect them seriously. They assume relationships will survive neglect. They assume opportunities will remain available forever. But life changes quickly. Very quickly. A single decision can permanently alter a future. A single emotional reaction can destroy trust. A single arrogant moment can ruin years of reputation. This is why wise people remain careful even after success. They understand how fragile life really is. They understand how quickly fortunes change. They understand how dangerous emotional certainty can become. Most importantly, they understand themselves. Self-awareness is the enemy of arrogance. A self-aware person notices when ego starts influencing behavior. They notice when pride makes them impatient. They notice when validation becomes addictive. They notice when they stop listening carefully. They notice when emotions begin replacing logic. That awareness protects them. Overconfident people rarely possess that protection because arrogance naturally resists self-examination. The ego avoids mirrors, especially honest mirrors. An arrogant person can sit in a room full of warning signs and still convince themselves they are winning. They interpret reality emotionally instead of accurately. They mistake temporary momentum for permanent superiority. That is why some people become more foolish as they become more successful. Success without humility becomes poison. It inflates weak character. It amplifies emotional immaturity. It rewards bad habits temporarily. And temporary rewards are dangerous because they trick people into believing destructive behavior is sustainable. It never is. No person escapes reality forever. No person avoids consequences forever. No person remains careless forever without eventually paying for it. Reality always arrives. And reality is merciless toward inflated egos. Because reality does not negotiate with self-delusion, it exposes it. The frightening thing about overconfidence is not that it makes people loud. The frightening thing is that it makes people blind. Blind to flaws, blind to risks, blind to emotional weakness, blind to changing circumstances, blind to the fact that life owes nobody permanent success. The moment a person stops respecting that truth, they begin drifting toward destruction. That is why real confidence looks different from arrogance. Real confidence remains calm under correction. Real confidence listens carefully. Real confidence asks questions. Real confidence does not need constant validation. Real confidence can say, "I was wrong," without feeling shattered internally. Because real confidence is secure enough to face reality honestly, arrogance cannot do that. Arrogance survives only through denial, and denial always collapses eventually. That is why disciplined people often outperform naturally talented people over long periods of time. Talent creates opportunities, but discipline preserves them. Talent attracts attention, but discipline builds stability. Talent may create fast victories, but discipline creates longevity. Longevity matters more, because anybody can appear powerful temporarily. Very few people remain strong consistently. Consistency requires emotional control. Consistency requires humility. Consistency requires resisting the temptation to believe your own hype. And that temptation becomes stronger every time life rewards you. The applause becomes addictive. People begin complimenting your intelligence, your confidence, your achievements, your potential. Slowly, if you are not careful, you begin constructing an identity around being impressive instead of becoming effective. That is where ego takes control. And once ego takes control, discipline starts dying quietly. You stop learning aggressively because learning reminds you that you are incomplete. You stop asking for advice because advice threatens your superiority. You stop admitting weakness because weakness no longer feels acceptable emotionally. And eventually you become trapped inside your own performance. That is the irony of arrogance. The person thinks they are becoming stronger while actually becoming more fragile, because fragility is not weakness of appearance. Fragility is the inability to tolerate truth. A truly strong person can face uncomfortable reality without collapsing emotionally. An arrogant person cannot. That is why arrogance eventually destroys itself. Not because life is unfair, but because reality always punishes blindness eventually. And the ego makes people blind long before they realize they are already falling. It is not the moment of failure. It is not the moment of pain. It is not the moment everything falls apart. The dangerous moment comes earlier than that. It is the moment a person secretly decides they no longer need to improve. That thought destroys more futures than lack of talent ever will. Because the moment a human being believes they have finally made it, their mind changes, their urgency fades, their discipline softens, their attention weakens, their hunger disappears. They stop attacking life with intensity because they begin assuming their current level is enough to protect them permanently. Nothing in life works that way. Nothing stays sharp without maintenance. Nothing stays powerful without discipline. Nothing stays successful without pressure. But arrogant people slowly forget this because success changes the chemistry of the mind. Praise affects people emotionally. Recognition affects people emotionally. Winning affects people emotionally. It creates comfort, and comfort is dangerous because comfort whispers a seductive lie, "You can relax now." That sentence ruins people. The athlete stops training with obsession. The businessman stops paying attention to details. The student stops studying deeply. The leader stops listening carefully. The creator stops improving their craft. And slowly, almost invisibly, decline begins. Not publicly at first, internally. The standards become lower. The effort becomes weaker. The focus becomes inconsistent. The discipline becomes selective. But because the person still has status, money, talent, attention, or past victories, they fail to notice the decay immediately. That is what makes overconfidence so dangerous. It hides deterioration behind previous success. A person could be weakening for years while still appearing successful on the outside. That illusion creates false security. The ego interprets old victories as proof of current superiority. It assumes that because something worked before, it will continue working forever. But life changes constantly. Conditions change. People change. Competition changes. Reality changes. And the person who stops adapting begins becoming obsolete without realizing it. That is why many people peak early and spend the rest of their lives emotionally trapped in the memory of who they used to be. They stop evolving because their identity becomes attached to previous success. Instead of growing, they begin protecting an image. That is the beginning of stagnation. The ego loves stagnation because stagnation feels safe. Growth requires vulnerability. Growth forces a person to admit they are incomplete. Growth requires humility. The ego hates humility because humility reminds people they are still human. Arrogant people want superiority, not humanity. They want to feel exceptional. They want to feel above correction. They want to feel untouchable. That desire creates dangerous behavior because once someone believes they are above correction, they stop refining themselves. They stop paying attention to flaws. They stop questioning decisions carefully. They become emotionally attached to being right, and emotionally attached people are incredibly easy to destroy. Because emotion clouds judgment. The ego cannot think clearly when its identity feels threatened. That is why arrogant people often make terrible decisions during pressure. Instead of adapting intelligently, they react emotionally. Instead of analyzing reality calmly, they defend their pride aggressively. Instead of adjusting, they double down. The ego would rather lose everything than admit weakness. That is why overconfidence becomes self-destructive. Not because confidence itself is dangerous, but because arrogance transforms confidence into emotional blindness. A wise person stays suspicious of their own comfort. An arrogant person worships comfort. That difference separates strong minds from weak ones. Strong minds understand that success is temporary unless constantly maintained. They understand that every victory creates new responsibilities. They understand that growth never ends. They understand that discipline must continue even after achievement. Weak minds believe achievement is the finish line. That mentality creates collapse. Because the moment someone believes they have arrived permanently, they stop moving with intensity. They stop sharpening themselves. They stop respecting the possibility of decline, and decline always punishes those who ignore it. The frightening truth is this: most people do not notice their downfall while it is happening. They only recognize it after consequences arrive. That is because decline usually happens gradually. One careless habit. One ignored warning. One emotional decision. One arrogant assumption. One day of laziness repeated 1,000 times. Small weaknesses accumulate quietly until suddenly the entire structure collapses under pressure. People watching from the outside are shocked. But the collapse was predictable. Every downfall leaves clues long before destruction becomes visible publicly. The problem is that arrogant people ignore clues because clues threaten the ego. The ego wants reassurance, not reality. That is why overconfident people surround themselves with comfort instead of truth. They prefer people who praise them instead of people who challenge them. They prefer environments where their identity feels protected instead of environments that force growth. But protected environments create fragile minds. Fragile minds cannot survive real pressure. This is why some people appear incredibly confident online, socially or professionally, but completely fall apart when real adversity enters their life. Their identity was built inside comfort. It was never tested properly. It was never forged through discipline, sacrifice, patience, and honest self-awareness. Real confidence survives pressure. Fake confidence survives applause. That difference becomes obvious eventually. Pressure reveals what comfort hides. Pressure exposes emotional weakness. Pressure exposes poor discipline. Pressure exposes fragile self-worth. Pressure exposes who built themselves properly and who merely created an impressive image. Images crack quickly under stress. Foundations endure. That is why disciplined people often look less exciting initially. They are careful, patient, thoughtful, measured. They rarely feel the need to prove themselves constantly because their confidence is rooted in preparation rather than attention. Meanwhile, arrogant people often become addicted to attention itself. Attention becomes emotional fuel. Validation becomes emotional fuel. Recognition becomes emotional fuel. Without realizing it, they slowly become dependent on external approval to maintain their identity. That dependence makes them weak psychologically because now their confidence is controlled by outside reactions instead of internal stability. A single criticism can shake them emotionally. A single rejection can destabilize them. A single failure can create panic. Why? Because the identity was never solid to begin with. It was inflated, and inflated things always burst eventually. The strongest people in the world are not obsessed with looking powerful. They are obsessed with becoming difficult to break. That mindset changes everything. It creates patience. It creates discipline. It creates emotional control. It creates humility. Most importantly, it creates longevity. Longevity is built quietly, day by day, decision by decision, habit by habit. Most arrogant people cannot tolerate that process because it feels too ordinary. They want dramatic transformation. They want instant superiority. They want immediate recognition. The ego always wants shortcuts. Reality never rewards shortcuts permanently. Eventually, shortcuts expose themselves. A person who skips discipline may still achieve temporary success. That temporary success becomes dangerous because it reinforces bad behavior. The person begins believing preparation is unnecessary. They believe instincts alone are enough. They believe talent alone is enough. Nothing alone is enough for long. That is why disciplined people eventually surpass arrogant people over time. The disciplined continue improving after success. The arrogant relax after success. The disciplined stay hungry. The arrogant become satisfied. The disciplined remain students. The arrogant begin acting like masters long before they deserve it. And life humiliates false masters eventually, every time. Reality has a way of exposing people who stopped growing, not immediately, but inevitably. Because stagnation creates weakness, even when weakness is hidden beneath status, confidence, or money. A person can appear successful while becoming mentally soft. A person can appear admired while becoming emotionally unstable. A person can appear powerful while becoming internally fragile. That contradiction destroys countless people because appearances delay honesty. The ego uses appearances to avoid reflection. If people admire me, I must still be winning. That thought blinds people. Admiration does not equal strength. Attention does not equal wisdom. Status does not equal discipline, and confidence does not equal accuracy. The moment someone forgets this, decline quietly begins. That is why truly intelligent people remain humble even after success. Not because they think poorly of themselves, but because they understand how quickly life changes. They understand how dangerous comfort can become. They understand how easy it is for the ego to distort reality. Most importantly, they understand that human beings are naturally vulnerable to self-deception. Especially after praise, especially after success, especially after power. The ego grows strongest when life rewards you. That is when discipline matters most. That is when humility matters most. That is when self-awareness becomes survival, because success is not what destroys people. The inability to handle success correctly destroys people. And the moment a person starts believing they no longer need discipline, growth, correction, or humility, they begin walking slowly toward collapse without even realizing it. Chapter 4. Arrogant people stop listening before they stop winning. The downfall does not begin when a person fails. It begins when they stop listening. That is the first real sign that arrogance has entered the mind, not loudness, not pride, not confidence. Silence toward correction. The moment a person becomes emotionally resistant to truth, they begin separating themselves from reality. And once someone becomes disconnected from reality, destruction becomes unavoidable sooner or later, because reality is the only thing that keeps human beings accurate. Without accuracy, intelligence becomes dangerous. Without accuracy, confidence becomes reckless. Without accuracy, power becomes self-destructive. This is why the most dangerous people are often not unintelligent people. They are talented people who stopped listening, the athlete who ignores coaches because success made him arrogant, the businessman who dismisses warnings because he believes his instincts are superior, the leader who surrounds himself with agreement instead of honesty, the student who thinks natural ability means preparation no longer matters, the creator who stops improving because applause convinced them they already mastered their craft. Every collapse begins the same way. The ego becomes louder than reality. At first, the change is subtle. The person interrupts more. They explain more than they observe. They react emotionally to criticism. They stop asking questions. They begin assuming instead of verifying. Slowly, their mind closes itself. That is the hidden danger of arrogance. Arrogance is not just pride. Arrogance is psychological blindness. And blind people walk confidently toward cliffs all the time. That is why overconfidence becomes more dangerous after success. Before success, most people remain cautious because they are still trying to prove themselves. They work harder. They listen carefully. They study intensely. They remain open to learning because survival depends on improvement. But after success, the ego whispers something poisonous. You already know enough. That sentence destroys growth immediately. The moment someone believes they already know enough, curiosity dies. And the death of curiosity is the beginning of mental decline. Curious people continue evolving. Arrogant people repeat themselves. That difference determines who survives long term. Because life constantly changes, skills become outdated, strategies stop working. People adapt, circumstances shift, technology evolves, competition improves. The person who stops learning becomes vulnerable immediately, even if they still appear successful temporarily. Temporary success hides weakness. That is why arrogant people often appear strong right before collapse. From the outside, everything still looks impressive. The money may still exist. The reputation may still exist. The confidence may still exist. But internally, something critical has already deteriorated. Their ability to receive truth. That ability matters more than talent itself. A teachable average person will eventually surpass an arrogant, gifted person over time because learning compounds while ego stagnates. The arrogant person becomes trapped inside their current identity. They stop evolving because evolution requires humility, and humility threatens superiority. That is why arrogant people secretly fear being wrong more than they fear failure itself. Being wrong damages the image they built. Failure can be explained away, but correction feels personal. So instead of adapting intelligently, they defend themselves emotionally. They justify mistakes. They rationalize weakness. They blame circumstances. They blame people. They blame luck. Anything except themselves. The ego will invent endless excuses to avoid accountability. Because accountability requires honesty. And honesty is painful when someone built their identity around superiority. This is why some people become impossible to help. Not because they lack intelligence, because they lack humility. You cannot teach a person who thinks learning is beneath them. You cannot guide a person who thinks advice insults their intelligence. You cannot save a person emotionally committed to their own delusion. Eventually, reality becomes their teacher. Reality teaches brutally. Unlike people, reality does not argue. Reality does not negotiate. Reality simply reveals consequences, and consequences expose truth faster than words ever can. A person can ignore advice for years. They cannot ignore results forever. That is why arrogant people often experience devastating collapses instead of small corrections. Their ego prevents small adjustments, so life eventually forces large consequences. A wise person adjusts early. An arrogant person waits until disaster. That difference changes entire lives. Wise people notice small weaknesses quickly. They correct habits immediately. They remain observant during success. They stay suspicious of comfort. They understand that discipline must continue long after achievement. Arrogant people interpret achievement as permission to relax. That mentality creates fragility. Because relaxed discipline always becomes future pain. Every lazy habit compounds. Every ignored flaw compounds. Every emotional reaction compounds. Every arrogant assumption compounds. Nothing stays small forever. Especially weakness. Weakness grows in silence. That is why disciplined people pay attention to details others ignore. They understand that small errors eventually become major consequences. They understand that character is built through repeated behavior. They understand that emotional control matters more than temporary confidence. Meanwhile, arrogant people become addicted to emotional certainty. They need to feel correct constantly. They need to feel dominant constantly. They need to feel respected constantly. That emotional dependence creates instability because life cannot provide constant validation forever. Eventually, rejection comes. Failure comes. Humiliation comes. Loss comes. And when those moments arrive, arrogant people often collapse emotionally because they never built internal resilience properly. Their identity depended too heavily on external success. The strongest people in the world build stability internally first. That is why they remain calm during chaos. They do not need every situation to confirm their value. They do not need every conversation to protect their pride. They do not need every disagreement to end in victory. Their self-worth is not built on appearing superior. It is built on discipline, competence, and truth. That creates emotional freedom. Arrogant people never experience that freedom because they are constantly defending an image. Every room becomes a performance. Every conversation becomes competition. Every challenge becomes threat. Living that way is exhausting. And eventually exhaustion weakens judgment. Weak judgment creates destruction. This is why emotionally insecure people often become the most arrogant outwardly. Arrogance frequently hides fragility. Loud superiority often hides deep fear. The person constantly trying to prove their intelligence usually doubts it privately. The person constantly demanding respect usually feels insecure internally. Real strength rarely needs constant advertisement. A lion does not spend its life convincing everyone it is dangerous. Only insecure people obsess over appearing powerful every moment. That obsession creates blindness because performance becomes more important than truth. And once truth becomes secondary, collapse becomes inevitable. Because truth is the foundation of long-term success. Truth about your weaknesses. Truth about your habits. Truth about your emotional immaturity. Truth about your blind spots. Truth about where you still need growth. Without those truths, a person cannot improve accurately. Improvement requires honest diagnosis. Arrogance destroys honest diagnosis. That is why arrogant people often repeat the same mistakes for years while blaming different circumstances every time. The environment changes, but the internal problem remains untouched, their ego. The ego protects patterns even when those patterns create suffering. That is what makes arrogance tragic. The person thinks they are protecting themselves while actually sabotaging themselves. Every avoided truth becomes future pain. Every ignored weakness becomes future humiliation. Every rejected correction becomes future consequence. Life gives warnings before destruction. The problem is that arrogant people interpret warnings emotionally instead of intelligently. They become offended instead of reflective, defensive instead of curious, reactive instead of observant, and eventually reality stops warning them gently. It begins correcting them harshly. That correction can arrive through failure, through embarrassment, through financial collapse, through broken relationships, through lost opportunities, through emotional burnout, through public humiliation. Reality has many methods, but the lesson remains the same every time. No person is above correction. No person is above discipline. No person is above consequences. The smartest people understand this deeply. That is why truly intelligent individuals often appear calmer than arrogant people. They know how much they still do not know. They understand how complex life really is. They understand how dangerous certainty can become. Arrogant people mistake certainty for strength. Wise people understand that certainty can become blindness. That is why wisdom listens carefully. Wisdom stays teachable. Wisdom remains curious even after success. Wisdom respects reality enough to keep learning, because the moment a person stops listening, they stop growing. And the moment a person stops growing, decline quietly begins, even if success still surrounds them temporarily. The ego cannot see this while it is happening. That is why arrogance is so dangerous. It convinces people they are rising while they are actually decaying internally. And by the time consequences arrive, the damage is often far greater than it needed to be. Chapter 5. Overconfidence makes people emotionally weak. Most people misunderstand strength. They think strength means speaking loudly. They think strength means never doubting yourself. They think strength means dominating conversations, appearing fearless, projecting certainty, and never admitting weakness. But real strength is much rarer than that. Real strength is emotional control. And overconfidence quietly destroys emotional control long before people realize it. That is why arrogant people often look powerful on the surface but collapse internally under pressure. Their confidence was never built on stability, it was built on emotional momentum. As long as life kept rewarding them, they felt invincible. But the moment resistance appeared, panic entered the system. Because confidence built on outcomes is fragile. The strongest people are not confident because life always goes well for them. They are confident because they can remain composed even when life does not. That difference changes everything. An arrogant person needs reality to cooperate emotionally. They need success to maintain their self-image. They need admiration. They need validation. They need recognition. Without those things, insecurity begins surfacing quickly. This is why overconfident people often react emotionally to very small challenges. A minor criticism ruins their mood. A disagreement feels disrespectful. A rejection feels humiliating. A failure feels catastrophic. A correction feels personal. Why? Because the ego interprets everything through identity. If someone criticizes their behavior, they hear, "You are weak." If someone questions their decision, they hear, "You are unintelligent." If someone outperforms them, they hear, "You are losing value." That emotional fragility creates instability in every area of life. Relationships become difficult because arrogant people struggle to apologize sincerely. Leadership becomes difficult because arrogant people resist feedback. Learning becomes difficult because arrogant people hate feeling inexperienced. Growth becomes difficult because arrogant people avoid situations where they might look imperfect. The ego protects comfort at all costs, but comfort weakens people. This is why some individuals stop evolving the moment they achieve moderate success. They become emotionally attached to feeling competent. Anything threatening that feeling becomes psychologically uncomfortable. So instead of entering situations where they might struggle, they retreat into environments where they already feel superior. That is the beginning of decline. Because human beings grow through pressure, not comfort. Pressure exposes weaknesses. Pressure forces adaptation. Pressure creates resilience. But arrogant people avoid pressure whenever it threatens their image. That avoidance creates emotional weakness disguised as confidence. The frightening thing is that many overconfident people genuinely believe they are mentally strong. They mistake emotional intensity for resilience. They mistake stubbornness for strength. They mistake pride for self-respect. But pride is unstable. Pride collapses easily when reality stops cooperating. Real emotional strength looks different. Real emotional strength remains calm during criticism. Real emotional strength can admit mistakes without emotional collapse. Real emotional strength tolerates discomfort. Real emotional strength stays rational under pressure. Real emotional strength listens before reacting. These qualities require humility, and humility is extremely difficult for the ego. Because humility forces people to confront a painful truth. No matter how talented, intelligent, successful, or respected you become, you are still vulnerable to mistakes. Arrogant people hate vulnerability. They want certainty. They want superiority. They want emotional invincibility. None of those things exist. Human beings are fragile creatures pretending to be permanent. That illusion creates endless suffering. The ego constantly tries to escape this reality by constructing identities around power, status, intelligence, appearance, or success. It hopes these things will create psychological safety. But external achievements cannot permanently stabilize internal insecurity. That is why some of the most outwardly confident people are secretly the most emotionally unstable. Their confidence depends entirely on external reinforcement. Remove the applause and they begin collapsing internally. Remove the status and panic appears. Remove the admiration and insecurity surfaces immediately. This is why emotional dependence on success becomes dangerous. Success should strengthen discipline. Instead, many people allow success to strengthen ego. That creates psychological weakness, because now failure becomes unbearable emotionally. The arrogant person does not simply dislike failure. They fear it deeply. Why? Because failure threatens identity. If their self-worth depends on appearing exceptional, then failure becomes existential. It feels like personal destruction rather than temporary setback. That emotional reaction makes intelligent recovery almost impossible. A calm person can learn from failure. An arrogant person becomes consumed by shame, anger, denial, or blame. The ego always protects itself emotionally before it protects truth. That is why overconfidence often leads people into repeated mistakes. They never examine themselves honestly enough to identify the real issue. Instead, they create explanations that preserve pride. It was bad luck. People were against me. They were jealous. The timing was wrong. The situation was unfair. Sometimes those explanations contain partial truth, but arrogant people use partial truth to avoid full accountability. And accountability is the foundation of emotional maturity. Emotionally mature people examine themselves honestly even when truth hurts. They understand that self-deception creates future suffering. They understand that temporary discomfort is better than permanent blindness. Arrogant people cannot tolerate temporary discomfort, so they create long-term destruction instead. This is why emotionally weak individuals often appear aggressive during pressure. Aggression becomes armor. Defensiveness becomes armor. Superiority armor armor, but armor is not strength. True strength does not panic under correction. True strength does not require domination constantly. True strength does not fear learning. True strength remains stable even when ego feels uncomfortable. That stability comes from self-awareness. Self-aware people recognize their emotional patterns. They notice when pride influences decisions. They notice when validation becomes addictive. They notice when anger replaces logic. They notice when insecurity disguises itself as arrogance. That awareness protects them from self-destruction. Overconfident people rarely possess that awareness because ego naturally resists observation. The ego wants to feel powerful, not examined. Examination creates humility. Humility weakens illusion, and illusion is what arrogant people depend on psychologically. That is why life eventually humiliates arrogant people publicly. Private correction was rejected too many times. Small lessons were ignored repeatedly, so eventually reality delivers consequences impossible to deny. Reality becomes brutal when subtle lessons fail. This pattern repeats everywhere. A businessman ignores warnings until bankruptcy forces humility. A leader ignores criticism until collapse destroys reputation. A relationship deteriorates slowly until separation forces self-reflection. A talented athlete ignores discipline until decline becomes unavoidable. A student wastes potential until failure removes illusion completely. The details change. The pattern stays identical. Arrogance delays honesty until honesty becomes painful. Wise people choose honesty early. That is why emotionally mature individuals remain grounded during success. They understand how quickly circumstances change. They understand how dangerous ego can become. They understand how fragile human judgment becomes when pride enters the mind. Most importantly, they understand that emotional control matters more than emotional intensity. An angry person is not powerful. A reactive person is not powerful. A loud person is not powerful. A defensive person is not powerful. They are emotionally uncontrolled, and uncontrolled emotions create destructive decisions. Many people ruin years of progress during moments of emotional arrogance. One impulsive statement, one reckless decision, one prideful reaction, one refusal to apologize, one attempt to protect ego instead of protecting long-term stability. The ego always prioritizes short-term emotional victory over long-term wisdom. That is why arrogant people often sabotage themselves while believing they are defending themselves. They cannot distinguish pride from self-respect anymore. Self-respect is calm. Pride is reactive. Self-respect accepts reality. Pride fights reality emotionally. Self-respect remains teachable. Pride rejects correction. Self-respect builds stability. Pride creates fragility. That difference determines who survives pressure. Because eventually life pressures everyone. Nobody escapes difficulty forever. Nobody escapes humiliation forever. Nobody escapes uncertainty forever. The question is not whether pressure will come. The question is whether your identity can survive it without collapsing emotionally. Arrogant identities cannot. They depend too heavily on appearing superior. The moment superiority disappears, panic begins. This is why many overconfident people secretly live with constant anxiety beneath the surface. Their identity requires endless maintenance. They must keep proving themselves. Keep winning, keep dominating, keep impressing others. That is exhausting psychologically. And exhaustion weakens judgment. Weak judgment creates destruction. Meanwhile, grounded people move differently. They do not need every room to validate them. They do not need constant admiration. They do not fear being wrong occasionally. They do not collapse emotionally under correction. Why? Because their identity is rooted in truth instead of performance. Truth creates stability. Performance creates pressure. That is why the strongest individuals often appear quieter than arrogant people. They are not wasting energy defending an illusion. They are focused on staying accurate, disciplined, observant, and emotionally controlled. That is real confidence. Everything else is emotional theater. And emotional theater eventually collapses the moment reality stops cooperating with the ego's performance. Chapter 6. The ego turns success into a slow poison. Success changes people. Not always immediately, not always visibly. But eventually, success begins revealing who a person truly is underneath discipline, struggle, and ambition. And for many people, success becomes the exact thing that destroys them. Not because success itself is dangerous, because the ego cannot handle success responsibly. Most people think failure ruins lives. Sometimes success ruins them faster. Failure usually humbles people. Failure forces reflection. Failure exposes weaknesses clearly, but success can create illusion. Success can make a person believe they are wiser than they actually are. It can make them believe their instincts are flawless. It can make them believe discipline is no longer necessary. That belief becomes poison. Slow poison, because success often removes the pressure that once kept people sharp. When people are struggling, they pay attention carefully, they work harder. They remain hungry, they stay alert because survival requires focus. But once comfort enters life, something dangerous begins happening psychologically. The urgency disappears. And without urgency, standards begin declining quietly. The person wakes up later, prepares less, studies less, reflects less, listens less, questions themselves less. At first, these changes seem harmless. But weakness rarely arrives dramatically. Weakness grows slowly through tolerated carelessness. That is why successful people sometimes collapse in shocking ways. Outsiders only see the final moment. They do not see the years of gradual mental decay that happened privately beforehand. The arrogance, the complacency, the emotional laziness, the loss of discipline, the addiction to comfort. All of it accumulates silently until eventually reality exposes everything at once. And reality always exposes people eventually. No matter how intelligent they are, no matter how admired they are, no matter how powerful they are, the ego convinces people they are exceptions. Reality reminds them they are human. That reminder usually arrives painfully. This is why wise people fear comfort more than struggle. Struggle sharpens attention. Comfort dulls it. Struggle creates discipline. Comfort weakens it. Struggle forces humility. Comfort feeds ego. A person fighting to survive usually remains teachable. A person drowning in praise often becomes blind. That blindness creates dangerous behavior. Successful people begin believing they no longer need systems. They trust emotion more than preparation. They trust instinct more than analysis. They trust confidence more than evidence. That is when mistakes multiply, not because they became unintelligent, because they became careless. Carelessness is one of the deadliest consequences of overconfidence. A careless person overlooks details. A careless person assumes instead of verifying. A careless person reacts emotionally. A careless person stops preparing thoroughly because preparation begins feeling unnecessary. But preparation is what created success originally. That is the irony. People abandon the very habits that built them once life starts rewarding them. The disciplined athlete stops training intensely after fame arrives. The businessman stops paying attention after money arrives. The creator stops improving after recognition arrives. The leader stops listening after authority arrives. And slowly, success transforms from blessing into poison. Because ego enters the system. The ego constantly seeks comfort after achievement. It wants celebration without continued sacrifice. It wants rewards without maintenance. It wants status without responsibility. Life never allows that for long. Anything valuable requires constant maintenance. Physical health, mental sharpness, relationships, character, discipline, reputation. Everything deteriorates without attention. But arrogant people forget this because success creates emotional illusion. It makes them feel stable when they are actually becoming fragile internally. Fragility hides well behind comfort. That is why many successful people become emotionally weak without noticing it. They avoid challenge because challenge threatens comfort. They avoid correction because correction threatens ego. They avoid difficult conversations because difficulty disrupts emotional security, and eventually they become psychologically soft. Soft people struggle when reality becomes uncomfortable. The strongest people remain disciplined after success. That is extremely rare. Most humans relax the moment life improves. They start believing survival mode is no longer necessary. They replace discipline with indulgence. They replace focus with distraction. They replace humility with entitlement. Entitlement destroys people slowly. An entitled person begins believing they deserve outcomes automatically. They stop respecting the process behind achievement. They stop appreciating effort. They stop valuing consistency. They expect life to continue rewarding them simply because it rewarded them before. Reality does not work that way. Yesterday's success guarantees nothing about tomorrow. Every day demands renewed discipline. Every day demands renewed awareness. Every day demands renewed humility. Arrogant people hate this truth because they want permanence. They want certainty. They want guarantees. They want success to become automatic. Nothing valuable remains automatic forever. Everything decays without maintenance. That includes human beings. The mind decays without learning. The body decays without discipline. Character decays without accountability. Relationships decay without effort. Success decays without humility. Wise people understand this deeply. That is why they remain students even after becoming masters. They continue learning because they know stagnation creates vulnerability. They understand how quickly life punishes complacency. Arrogant people stop learning because learning reminds them they are incomplete. The ego wants completion. It wants superiority. It wants finality, but there is no final version of yourself. Human beings are either growing or deteriorating. There is no permanent middle ground. That truth terrifies arrogant people because it means discipline can never truly end. The work continues forever. Reflection continues forever. Improvement continues forever. The ego wants to rest permanently. Reality never permits permanent rest, especially not for ambitious people. The moment ambition disappears, decline begins. And overconfidence kills ambition by creating false satisfaction. A person begins admiring themselves instead of improving themselves. That distinction matters enormously. Self-admiration creates stagnation. Self-awareness creates growth. The ego wants admiration because admiration feels pleasurable emotionally. It creates temporary superiority. It creates emotional comfort. But emotional comfort is often the enemy of greatness. Greatness requires discomfort repeatedly. Discomfort of discipline, discomfort of honesty, discomfort of sacrifice, discomfort of admitting weakness, discomfort of confronting reality accurately. Arrogant people avoid these discomforts because their identity depends on feeling superior already. That creates dangerous psychological stagnation. The person becomes emotionally attached to their current version of themselves. They stop evolving because evolution requires temporarily feeling inadequate. Most egos cannot tolerate that feeling. So instead of becoming stronger, people become performers. They start managing appearance instead of improving substance. That is why some successful individuals become obsessed with image. Image becomes protection. If people continue admiring them publicly, they can avoid confronting internal weakness privately. But reality eventually bypasses image completely. Reality examines foundations, and foundations reveal truth. A weak foundation eventually collapses, no matter how beautiful the exterior appears. That collapse shocks arrogant people because they genuinely believed appearances were enough. They believed charisma could replace preparation. They believed confidence could replace competence. They believed success could replace discipline permanently. Reality punishes those beliefs eventually. Always, no exceptions. This is why the strongest people remain humble during success. Not because they lack confidence, but because they understand how fragile life really is. They understand how quickly fortunes change. They understand how dangerous ego becomes when constantly rewarded. Most importantly, they understand themselves. Self-awareness protects successful people from becoming intoxicated by success. Without self-awareness, praise becomes addictive. Addiction creates dependence. Dependence creates fragility. Fragility creates fear. And fear creates arrogance. That is why many arrogant people are secretly terrified beneath the surface. Their entire identity depends on maintaining superiority. They fear losing status. They fear looking weak. They fear failure, exposing their insecurity publicly. So they overcompensate. They become louder, more defensive, more dismissive, more emotionally reactive. But none of those behaviors create strength. They only reveal fear wearing arrogance as a disguise. Real confidence does not panic under threat. Real confidence remains stable during uncertainty. Real confidence can survive embarrassment, failure, correction, and discomfort without emotional collapse. Why? Because real confidence is grounded in truth. Not image, not applause, not temporary success. Truth. And truth keeps people disciplined even after life starts rewarding them. That is the difference between successful people who endure and successful people who self-destruct. One remains humble enough to continue evolving. The other falls in love with their own reflection. And the moment a human being falls in love with their reflection more than reality, decline quietly begins beneath the surface, even if the world still calls them successful. Chapter 7. In the end, reality humiliates every illusion. At the beginning, overconfidence feels like power. That is why people protect it so fiercely. It gives them emotional comfort. It removes uncertainty temporarily. It creates the feeling of superiority. It allows people to walk through life believing they are safer, smarter, stronger, and more capable than everyone around them. But eventually, reality arrives. And reality is ruthless toward illusion, not immediately. That is what makes arrogance so dangerous. Reality is patient. It allows people to continue believing lies about themselves for years sometimes. It allows them to collect praise, attention, money, validation, status, victories. And during that period, the arrogant person becomes even more convinced that their mindset is working. But reality is always observing. Every careless habit, every ignored warning, every emotional reaction, every avoided truth, every act of laziness disguised as confidence. Every moment discipline was replaced by ego. Reality records all of it silently. And eventually the bill arrives. That is the terrifying thing about overconfidence. The consequences are delayed. If consequences arrived immediately, people would change faster. But arrogance often rewards people temporarily before destroying them permanently. That temporary reward creates false belief. The person starts assuming they are untouchable because nothing bad has happened yet. Yet, that word destroys arrogant people eventually, because consequences delayed are not consequences cancelled. The athlete who ignores discipline may still win for a while. The businessman who ignores warnings may still make money for a while. The leader who stops listening may still maintain authority for a while. The arrogant person mistakes temporary survival for permanent immunity. That mistake ruins lives. No human being is above reality. No human being is above discipline. No human being is above consequences. Eventually, every illusion breaks. Some break publicly, some privately. But all illusions collapse eventually because illusion requires constant maintenance while reality simply exists. That is why truth always wins long term. Truth does not need performance. Truth does not need manipulation. Truth does not need protection. Reality remains reality whether people acknowledge it or not. Arrogant people spend enormous energy trying to protect identities that reality already knows are fragile. That is why they become exhausted emotionally. The ego is exhausting. It constantly demands defense, defense against criticism, defense against failure, defense against insecurity, defense against embarrassment, defense against truth. A person living through ego is constantly fighting invisible battles because their identity depends on superiority. Every challenge becomes personal. Every disagreement becomes threat. Every correction becomes emotional injury. That is not strength. That is fear disguised as confidence. Real strength is calmer. Real strength does not panic when corrected. Real strength does not collapse during failure. Real strength does not need constant admiration. Real strength survives truth. That is the final lesson arrogant people eventually learn through pain. Truth is not the enemy. Truth is the only thing that can actually protect you. A painful truth early is infinitely cheaper than a devastating consequence later. Wise people understand this. That is why they examine themselves constantly. They remain students. They remain observant. They remain grounded even during success because they understand how dangerous self-deception can become. They know human beings naturally drift toward comfort, pride, laziness, and illusion. So they fight those tendencies intentionally. They stay disciplined after success. They stay humble after praise. They stay careful after victory. They stay teachable after achievement. That mindset creates longevity. Longevity is one of the rarest forms of success in existence. Anybody can appear powerful temporarily. Very few people remain strong consistently across years. Consistency requires humility. Consistency requires emotional control. Consistency requires resisting the temptation to believe your own hype. Most people fail that test, especially after life starts rewarding them. Success reveals character faster than struggle ever could. During struggle, people remain focused because survival depends on it. But once comfort arrives, true character appears. Some people become grateful, others become arrogant. Some people become disciplined, others become entitled. Some people become wiser, others become intoxicated by themselves. And intoxicated people always lose clarity eventually. Clarity matters more than confidence. Because clarity keeps people accurate. Accuracy keeps people disciplined. Discipline keeps people stable. Stability keeps people alive mentally, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. Arrogance destroys stability by separating people from accurate self-awareness. The ego creates fantasy versions of reality where the person is always exceptional, always correct, always superior. But reality does not care about self-image. Reality only responds to behavior. That is why arrogant people often feel shocked when consequences finally arrive. They spent years protecting an illusion instead of correcting themselves honestly. By the time consequences appear, the gap between self-perception and reality has become enormous. That gap creates collapse. Some people recover from that collapse, many do not. Because humiliation affects the ego violently. A person who built their identity around superiority often cannot psychologically survive exposure. They become bitter, defensive, angry, broken. They spend years blaming circumstances instead of confronting themselves honestly. But the rare individuals who survive collapse become transformed by it. Pain humbles them. Failure sharpens them. Consequences wake them up. They finally understand what arrogance prevented them from seeing for years. Confidence without humility becomes self-destruction. That realization changes everything, because now the person stops chasing appearances. They stop trying to look powerful constantly. They stop seeking superiority emotionally. They stop performing confidence. Instead, they begin building something real. Discipline, self-awareness, emotional control, patience, humility, consistency. Those qualities are quieter than arrogance, but infinitely stronger. The world often misunderstands quiet strength because modern culture rewards performance. Loud people receive attention quickly. Arrogant people often appear charismatic initially. Overconfident individuals may even look inspiring temporarily because certainty is emotionally attractive. But emotional attraction is not truth. Many dangerous things appear attractive initially. Overconfidence is one of them, because overconfidence feels powerful while silently weakening the mind underneath. It removes caution, it removes curiosity, it removes discipline, it removes self-awareness, and eventually it removes stability completely. That is why wise people fear arrogance more than failure. Failure teaches, arrogance blinds. A person who can still learn can still grow, but a person consumed by ego eventually becomes unreachable. And unreachable people destroy themselves slowly. The saddest part is that many arrogant people never realize what truly ruined them. They blame bad luck, other people, circumstances, timing, competition, anything except the real cause, their inability to remain humble after success, their inability to remain disciplined during comfort, their inability to face truth without emotional resistance. That inability destroys more potential than lack of intelligence ever will. Talent is common. Discipline is rare. Confidence is common. Self-awareness is rare. Ambition is common. Humility is rare, and humility is what protects human beings from becoming intoxicated by themselves. Without humility, power becomes corruption, success becomes poison. Confidence becomes blindness. Eventually, every person must choose which version of confidence they want. The loud version built on ego, or the quiet version built on truth. One seeks admiration, the other seeks accuracy. One collapses under pressure, the other grows stronger through pressure. One performs strength, the other becomes strong. And in the end, reality exposes the difference between them every single time, because reality cannot be manipulated forever. Reality cannot be impressed forever. Reality cannot be deceived forever. Eventually, life strips away performance and reveals who a person truly became underneath all the confidence, attention, achievements, and words. That moment comes for everyone. And when it arrives, the people who survive are never the ones who thought they were above consequences. They are the ones who respected truth enough to keep correcting themselves long before reality was forced to humble them publicly. That is the final lesson. Overconfidence does not destroy people because they believed in themselves. It destroys them because they stopped questioning themselves. And the moment a human being stops questioning themselves honestly, their downfall has already begun, even if the world still sees them as successful for a little while longer.